Welcome back. Imagine tourism in the future. Travelers could be forced to learn to scuba dive to visit Nelson Mandela's former prison cell in Cape Town, which may then be underwater. But this won't happen if climate change is addressed. The World Wildlife Fund is calling on citizens to fight climate change with droughts, wildfires, flooding, as well as the tsunamis that are increasing. The climate emergency is upon us. Future warming will negatively impact food systems in Africa by shortening growing seasons and increasing water stress. For more on this, World Wildlife Fund Head of Business Development, Justin Smith, joins us for this conversation. Justin, thank you so much for your time this morning. I mean, we can never have a conversation enough about addressing climate change. I guess maybe the question is there political as well as private sector will to actually address the effects of climate change in the country?
Good morning, Faith. You're spot on. I think it's hard for us sometimes to worry about future impacts when we've got a lot of challenges today that we're dealing with. But we have seen a lot of movement from both the government and business sector around climate change commitments in the last couple of years. I think central to that is a really big sort of global financing package around the just transition for South Africa that was agreed at the last COP in Glasgow in November 2021. So we really want to see what that means in terms of increasing renewable energy investment in South Africa, as well as making sure we don't leave behind the workers and the current businesses that are involved in some of our coal-based industries in South Africa either. We know there's a lot of businesses who've committed to shifting their kind of energy mix to moving towards what we call net zero by 2050 as well. So there's movement, but I think there's all of the sort of approximation of what that means is showing that it's not enough yet. We still need quicker action. We need people to realize that if we don't, substantially shift what we're doing at the moment by 2030, we're going to get stuck with impacts that we actually can't reverse anymore. So it is a crisis, and I think people aren't quite seeing that, even though we are seeing more and more of these extreme events being part of our lives almost every single day.
Yeah. I mean, you're saying that it is a crisis. People are not seeing that. What would it take for people to see? In the South African context, I think we were even having a conversation around the way in which the weather patterns are changing. They're changing so much so that we cannot help but take a look and say, if we have to compare it to, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years ago, did we see this amount of sporadic events that are happening, this amount of flooding, where an entire province has now been declared a state of national disaster simply because of the flood it's undergoing? If we have to compare KwaZulu-Natal, for example, to about 20, 30 years ago, are we looking at this as being perhaps the impact that climate change is actually having on the country, and how, whether we like it or not, we're going to be affected unless we do something?
That's absolutely right, Faith. All of the predictions, since a lot of the climate science started, was for the eastern parts of South Africa to have more sporadic flooding events, the western parts of our country to be drier. And I think that's played out in South Africa so much faster than we expected. It was only 4 or 5 years ago that we were dealing with the sort of day zero issues in the western part of South Africa and in the Western Cape in particular. We now have, in this year, we've seen massive tsunamis hit our eastern coast through Mozambique, Malawi, and now KwaZulu-Natal as well. So much more regularly than it's ever happened in the past, so much more massive the actual impact as well. Alongside that, we've seen just in 2022, the biggest ever temperature differentials in Antarctica, somewhere around almost 40 degrees Celsius above what's normal that time of the year. We've seen temperature records in Cape Town this year. These are not things that people can just say, oh, it's always happened before. We've always had floods. We've always had... this is a magnification of that way beyond what's been predicted by science or even by the insurance sector. So we're really, really hitting a critical point here. And this is, not just an environmental issue. This is people's livelihoods, people's lives that are being impacted. It's really a cause for concern and a cause for us to think about what we do as citizens and as businesses as well.
Yeah, I mean, in often cases, we'll see that developed countries such as the likes of places in Europe as well as Americas have been often criticized for not taking enough action when it comes to climate change. And what's also been said to happen is that the effects that are happening in the more developed countries are going to trickle down to the more developing nations. So the third world countries, the second world countries are going to feel the impact of the decisions that are being held at that kind of level. Is there any way of propelling those global leaders or the leaders of the first world nations, which are now hampering on the third world nations, to actually take a more stringent approach to climate change? Because I tell you one thing here, it seems as though first world nations, Justin, do not care about climate change as would, for example, a third world or a developing country.
It's so true, Faith. We're seeing the worst impacts in many cases happening on small and emerging economies around the world. Small island states are going to be basically flooded away. Many of our sort of African countries with food security impacts around drought and flooding being massive, massive, massive for us as well. I think the only nuance to that is South Africa is a little bit different from the rest. We've got our own massive impacts in terms of our energy mix that we've had in South Africa for many years. So we are a very big emitter as well and have to take some responsibility for shifting that. But we can't do it without first world countries helping us and other nations with the financing that's required to actually do that in a measured way, particularly in a way that we don't lose jobs in a country where we already have an employment crisis.
Yeah, it is, as I said, it's a certain crisis at this moment in time. Is there any way that us as a civil society can play a bigger role in being able to tackle climate change? So in our worlds, in our communities, in our homes, what is a basic minimum that we can do in our effort to curb climate change?
I think starting with our kind of business lives, make sure that the organizations that we're part of, that we're working on, have got a commitment around what their impacts from a climate change perspective are going to do and how we're going to reduce those. And then in our own sort of lives, this is probably a very unpopular scenario because of what we see from an ESCOM perspective in South Africa. But as much as we do load shedding, where we can be efficient from an energy perspective and try and reduce our energy mix in our own homes, that's going to help us in terms of the sort of climate impacts around it. We need to continue to be as water efficient as possible. We're one of the 30 driest countries in the world. So we're always going to go through these sort of drought flood scenarios, and our own sort of behavior around it has got to shift, and people have got to kind of take on that as well. And then I think that the idea that we can just sort of create stuff and use it and throw it away, just isn't reality either. We've got to make sure that we look at being more circular in what we do. Simple behaviors around things like recycling are important from an environmental perspective, but they also create a lot of jobs in South Africa around that sort of recycling industry as well. So those are small things. Also understanding the impacts of each of our decisions, what the kind of food we eat has got a climate impact, the kind of things we decide to do from a transport perspective have got a climate impact. And I know that's not always easy for South Africa in terms of the choices we have, but it is something to think about and try and consider changing behavior around.
Got you. Justin, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much for your time this morning. World Wildlife Fund, Head of Business Development, Justin Smith.